Thank you very much, Peter, Shadi, and Nathan for excellent presentations. We now have about 20 minutes for Q&A. I'd like to start by one that's obviously on my mind, which is the future of democracy. What will this do to the future of democracy in the Arab world if Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt or in other countries are, designated as terrorist organizations and therefore excluded from, political participation? Is democracy still possible? Is there a way to democratize these countries without, the large movements of Muslim Brotherhood? Also, the possibility of radicalization, if they are excluded from political participation, will this mean that, more members, or especially younger members, will be more radical or will become more violent in the future? Anybody wants to?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, the part of the issue here is that the Republican Party doesn't really believe in democracy in the Middle East. So there is that. And also large portions of the Democratic Party, as I would argue we saw under Obama, undermining democratic transitions. After an initial period of optimism that lasted for about 6 months, you start to see the beginnings of a reversal. So, but I think that as Americans, by definition, we should believe in the ideals that we claim to uphold at home. And that's something that we have to keep on, I think, emphasizing when we speak about this issue, that America was founded with moral purpose. We are a mission-driven, ideological country, if you will. And part of our ideology is that we believe our ideals are universally applicable. And that includes in places like the Middle East. And, for all of his faults, George W. Bush was actually somewhat eloquent on this in a couple speeches he gave in 2003 and 2004 during the first Arab Spring, which we forget about. But again, he reversed himself for reasons we don't have to go into right now. But it is a theme that we see in American policy, this kind of seed of optimism about democracy in the Middle East. But then we see who wins, Islamist parties, and we're like, actually, maybe we don't believe in democracy as much as we thought. So, but ultimately, I would argue there will be transition somewhere, democratic transition somewhere in the Middle East eventually. Maybe not right away, but it's hard to imagine. The thing is, not very few people predicted the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011. The fact that it would start in Tunisia, no one really saw that coming. So we have to remember that some of these changes are hard to predict ahead of time, and we have to anticipate. We have to think ahead. These are brittle regimes that don't enjoy the consent of the governed. And for that reason, they're always teetering on the edge. Now, they can teeter on the edge for a long time. We've been talking about Egypt being on the brink for years now. But sooner or later, I do believe that something's got to give. Now, if that's going to be in 10 years, then that matters. And we should start thinking ahead instead of just finding ourselves in the moment 10 years from now and having to restart this conversation from scratch. And just very quickly, one thing that's remarkable about the Brotherhood in Egypt, that despite the level of oppression they faced, the brutality they faced, including the worst massacre in modern Egyptian history, or perhaps even in Egyptian history for all I know, is that there has been relatively little radicalization. And that tells us something about the Muslim Brotherhood ethos in Egypt, which is violence is not really a live option. And there's something about the Brotherhood educational system, the curriculum they follow, that actually inculcates a commitment to nonviolence, which I actually have to say is somewhat impressive, because I think from an academic standpoint, we might expect that more Brotherhood members would have radicalized after the coup and the massacre, but actually a lot of that did not come to pass.
Nathan?
So let me just pick up some themes in Shadi's answer. What would designation here, and what effect would it have? I think very little, because I think the damage has already been done. In a sense, sort of this movement milieu, which Peter talked about, going to tie to something that Shadi said, was gravitating in kind of a direction towards electoral politics. And that was killed at Rabah and at similar times at similar places in other countries in the region. So this idea that you form a political party, you run in elections, you get a fair share of the vote, you may even win the elections. That model doesn't work, or it hasn't worked. I'm not saying it can't work. It just did not work. And nobody's really thinking in those terms that I'm aware of right now. What designation does, however, is it creates a language, right? When the Egyptian regime banned Muslim Brotherhood in what it was December 1948, there was no terrorism legislation. They banned it, okay? When the Syrian government did the same, they banned it. But there is now this kind of international, I would say, just like Brotherhood movements borrow from each other, anti-terrorism legislation just kind of like moves from one country to another, and that's happening. But in a sense, that's already happened. The Brotherhood has been designated in many countries a terrorism, essentially because there is this international language. I will say one other thing that's a little bit more hopeful. I think, so if you look at the political process, and this sort of hopeful democratic moment, I think, of a decade, a little bit more than a decade ago, has expired. That doesn't mean these societies are stagnant. And here I will say something that is just extremely impressionistic. But when I travel to some of these societies that went through the events of 2011, or the years before and the years after, I do find some dynamism. It's not in the political realm. It's in the social realm. It's in culture. It's in art. It sometimes expresses itself in art. Just in how youth communicate with each other. I think these are much more dynamic societies than appear, and we're not necessarily going to see that in any predictable form. This is where I've got to end the same place that Shadi does. This will express itself politically in some way at some time. I'm just not sure how. But if I were hopeful for sort of a more democratic future, I wouldn't look right now specifically at the political process, but I would basically just start paying a lot more attention to how young people talk to each other.
Peter?
So I think I would just add that I would agree that those interested in designating the Muslim Brotherhood right now here in the United States don't care about the region. They're not thinking about the region when they pursue this outcome. Because, not least of all, because, as Nathan mentioned, due to pressures from countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, there has been a region-wide effort to suppress and dismantle the infrastructure of movement Islam in the Middle East. So it's not like there's this thriving entity inclined towards political violence in Egypt called the Muslim Brotherhood that needs to be designated now, right? The MB in Egypt has been decimated. Rather, the current designation effort has as its endpoint the American political landscape. And so I think the conversation about this issue needs to keep its focus and eye on that side of it.
Thank you. So we'll take one question from the audience, and then do we have questions from the Zoom participants? Okay. I saw Jamal first, and then Isam. Use the mic, please, behind you.
Thank you. Just 3 points. First one, what I have heard from, at least from Shadi, it's a sort of litigation about Muslim Brotherhood. That they are good, they have the right, all of these things, as we are in a court. From my point of view, what we need actually more, a real politique approach to understand Muslim Brotherhood as a historical phenomenon in 2 dimensions. First one, it is a transformable organization. Muslim Brotherhood in 30s, totally different from what they been in 50s, 70s, 90s, and now. So it's not one phenomenon. It is in a continuous transformation. This is one. Second, when we are talking about democracy, also again, what most of the talks, it's sort of litigation. From my point of view, democratization, it's an outcome of a real conflict in the societies, whether we like this or we don't. This is the history of Europe, and this is also what is going on in the Arab world. There is a counter-revolution, whether this counter-revolution use the slogans of anti-Islamism or anti-Islam, but in fact, it's anti-democracy. So democracy also, it's an outcome of a real, concrete conflict in the region. It's not a matter of...
Jamal, do you have a question,
no,
please? Because
no, just
Okay.
these 2 points.
comments. Okay.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
it.
Hissam?
Thank you all for a very informative session. I do want to bring it down to the U.S. context. I think what Dr. Mandeville mentioned, that really you look at the question and the efforts, and you come back to the American scene as possibly being the focus of the aftermath of what happens with the designation. And if we look at Senator Cruz and the efforts that have been done through the Congress, I mean, they're taking it to a different level. They're switching the burden of proof now. They're, as Professor Brown mentioned, they're like asking the administration basically to come up with reasons to designate, as opposed to asking them to go through the rigor of the legal process to be able to deliver. And they're using a multi-layered process to be able to use the easy designation of the already designated groups, and then build a structure where they would point to other groups that arguably have connections with the MB through their history, through their interactions, whatever, and use these as through material support or through guilt by association, and so on and so forth. So again, it is a politically motivated, concerted effort to get to it. Having said that, I think I concur fully with a lot of the kind of like theoretical or maybe intellectual foundations for a lot of what's being discussed. The question is, how do we, given the current administration, given the way it has been enacting, and it has been, by the way, designating cartels and smaller groups as terrorist organizations, several of them, in fact, over the last few months, using executive order as a way to do it. Knowing the administration, knowing how it works, knowing Congress in its current state, how do we develop a strategy now that we're concerned about the aftermath of something such as a designation, both on the Muslim American community and I think on the American society as a whole? I mean, I think we're constitutionally, we're challenging constitutional foundations. How do we approach this best? Because a lot of them, they're going to look at these arguments and it doesn't make sense to them even, they're going to still continue with whatever they want. So I wanted some insight on how people think that this should be countered.
Take one more question from the floor. Yes, please.
This sort of builds on the prior question. I don't know how familiar everyone in the room is with how far along this process is. So I'm actually curious if I think Dr. Brown was saying that it's a politically inflected process, but you also made it sound like there's a lot of bureaucratic elements to figuring out, how do we designate or what. So I'm curious actually how far along is the Republican Party and or its allies who are working on this in the process of designating the Muslim Brotherhoods as a terrorist organization? And I'm also curious who the constituents are that are really fighting for this. So I imagine the Saudi government, the Emirati government, the Egyptian government, the Israeli government. Who is kind of behind this in partnership with the elements of the Republican Party that are interested in seeing this come to fruition? Thank you.
Thank you. You can answer any of the three questions or comments.
Well, to engage the question of, how does one approach this problem? I mean, I think what one doesn't do is to try to tell very nuanced histories of the evolution of the Brotherhood from the 1940s through the 1990s. Those that are pushing this designation process, they don't care. You could give them the most nuanced, detailed historical account of why this movement pursued different strategies at different times, and they'll be asleep by the time you reach the 1950s, right? We need to engage this for what it's about. Senator Cruz has been very clear that this is ultimately about American Muslim organizations. So what worries me is that we live in a time when we can't trust the otherwise quite rigorous bureaucratic processes that would be involved in things like terrorist designation, right? When you look at the State Department's foreign terrorist designation process, it's a very robust interagency effort that gathers information from a wide range of departments across the U.S. Government. And when that effort has been tried in the past, it has always failed on the merits because the US government did not have information suggesting that the Muslim Brotherhood was involved in terrorism, and or the effort was to designate something called the Global Muslim Brotherhood that has no organizational form that could be so designated. And that's why I think with respect to the current effort, two things to bear in mind. One is that I think American Muslim organizations need to get more skilled at talking about their origins and their histories. There has been a tendency that I've encountered in the American Muslim landscape, because of the alarmism around the Muslim Brotherhood issue, to kind of stick their heads in the sand and be like, Muslim Brotherhood, never heard of that. We have nothing to do with them. We've never been connected to them. And that doesn't help, because the connections between American Muslim organizations in the 60s and Haraki Islam, movement Islam in various regions is very clear. But there's also a very clear history about how the American Muslim organizational landscape came into its own and developed its own distinctive American identity that I think is important and will be important to share with, for example, congressional staffers that are possibly involved in this. And second, I do think it is important to make the case that, this is not the impulse here that goes to your question doesn't come out of the MAGA scene. The MAGA scene doesn't really think much about the Muslim Brotherhood. This tends to come out of a group of people that have been working on this for years, that are sort of pre-Trump and are hoping to use the vehicle of a Trumpian administration that simply declares things by fiat rather than running proper, robust bureaucratic processes, to use that tendency as a vehicle to get what they've been trying to do. And so I think there's a conversation to be had with the Republican Party, including MAGA adjacent segments of it, about how this is bad for them.
Yes. So one thing to argue with Republicans is to say Trump wants to be a negotiator. And if you designate Brotherhood organizations as terrorists, it makes it harder for Trump to play the role that he supposedly wants to play. So that could be one approach. But I have a bit of an easier solution on how to counter this that applies to the Muslim community. And I know MPAC is a nonpartisan organization, so I'm just saying this as an individual here. But let's hope Democrats win in 2026 next year, the midterms, and let's hope they win in 2028. The Republican Party, in my view, and I know I don't know if this is controversial, but it's just obviously not a home for American Muslims. There is overlap on social issues, I get that, but I think that, we've seen over the last, 8 or 9 months that these ideas that there could be a future for American Muslims in a kind of Trumpified Republican Party, I think it's very hard to make that argument now. The Democratic Party sucks. It's feckless and pathetic. But I think that when push comes to shove, we have two choices, and I'm under no illusions now. And I supported Kamala very reluctantly. It was a game time decision that I had to make. I know a lot of us struggled with that. But now I think it's clear what we have to do in the future. That's just my opinion.
Well, most of the discussion is about American politics, where I don't claim any great expertise. The one lesson I would get from Peter's remarks is, in response to your question about strategy, don't invite Nathan Brown, he'll put everybody to sleep. And I think that's essentially right. I mean, I don't mind putting people to sleep. That's my job as a professor. But as politically, no, that is not the strategy. I don't know about the partisan argument you're making. My impression, by the way, and this is very impressionistic, is kind of the social conservative overlap. That's older generation, younger generation. My impression doesn't think quite the same way. But I'd come back to sort of Peter's story, which I actually think is both powerful and I think, it's not my area of expertise, I think it's accurate. That what you have is, if you're talking about American Muslim community, that is a sort of in the single, that is something that has sort of a real set of institutions. They emerged over the last half century or so, and they emerged as an attempt to try and find a way to have Muslim communal life in an American context. And that means an American legal context. That means kind of reinventing Islam. So it was, a mosque could go where there were legal provisions for a church. It could become religion as Americans understand religion. And that's there right now. So essentially whatever its origins, and its origins were partly in the Ikhwan, or people from the Ikhwan, they had a mosque in the country that they came from. Okay, how do you build a mosque in America? They were asking questions like this. But the answers as it operates today these are thoroughly American institutions. And so there is a sort of a distinct set of institutional forms that fit in very easily in this country. That would be the story I would tell. And like I say, I think it's true.
Okay, we're gonna take 2 more questions from the floor and maybe 1 or 2 questions from the Zoom webinar. Yes, the lady.
Hi, I want to thank you all. Really great presentations. I'm just going to mention the elephant in the room because last year, Rami Khouri and I published a book called Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters, which obviously is in many ways connected with the story of that particular Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine. And their decision in 2006 to participate in good order in a democratic election, the parliamentary elections in Palestine, the fact that after they won it, the United States government, the Israeli government came down on them like a ton of bricks, and they have been obviously very much suffering ever since from the siege and the genocide. And I think that we need, if you as Muslim community activists want to deal with this issue, you have to find a way also to deal with the question of Hamas and what it is. You don't have to agree with what Rami and I did, but I have to say that our book has received a huge amount of support from a lot of people around the country who dare not even mention the H word in public because of the demonization.
What's the title of your book?
Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. I got flyers here if anybody wants afterwards. So I am also a member of the Friends Meeting of Washington. And I think that the fact, as Shadi mentioned, that there's a lot of kind of suspicion from liberals about Muslim political sort of religiosity, religion-motivated engagement in politics. And I think that's changing. Because partly of the Gaza crisis, maybe mainly because of the Gaza crisis, but there was a long time when liberals were kind of dubious about Muslims in particular, at a time when they were not particularly dubious about Jews in particular, or even Christians in particular, because of the stellar record of the Quakers and other liberal Christian congregations. So I think, how do you strengthen that capability for people who are liberals in this society to see Muslim congregations, Muslim organizations as, on a spectrum, just like many Christian or Jewish congregations and organizations?
Thank you. Okay, we'll take a question from here. Is there a question here? No. Okay. Luay, and then you.
Okay, thank you very much for excellent presentations. You shed light on different aspects of the issue. And I agree with you, this is not about the brotherhoods in the Middle East, it's about here. And in fact, probably because I mean, to begin with, the Brotherhood has been banned in many Middle Eastern countries, including Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. And since then, the foreign minister of the Emirates, Abdullah bin Zayed, has been on a crusade to try to expand it into the West. But I would like to, I mean, I don't have a question, I have just one brief comment. I think the best approach really is not, I agree with you, it makes no sense to try to look at the history of the organization or to focus on it to begin with. I think the approach of Muslim organizations should be on the fact that this is an American. This is anti-democratic. This is the beginning of unraveling the American democracy. If they can do it for the Muslim, they can do it for anybody else. I mean, that should be the approach. And if you do that, then probably many Americans will stand, with us. Not, but if you take it like it's a Muslim thing, it's not a Muslim thing really. It's an attempt to sort of entrench this autocratic new approach to the United States that has been, of course, celebrated by the MAGA and with the current president, Trump. So I think that's what I would like to say. And by the way, Abdullah bin Zayed is already on record designating impacts and care and many Muslim organizations that are vital for the civil liberties of this community as brotherhood organizations.
Thank you, Luay. We have a couple of questions from the participants in Zoom. Okay, yeah, we'll come back.
Oh.
We'll come back.
We could answer those maybe. Yeah.
Answer these or take a few more?
No,
Answer the,
Just we'll forget.
okay, all right, okay. Go ahead.
Okay, I could start since okay. So, the elephant in the room, Hamas, I just want to say a couple of things on that. First of all, I think there is again, an unfortunate lesson, which I sort of alluded to in other cases, that when Islamist parties try to do what they're supposed to do, they get punished for it. And that's sort of, Hamas was trying to go in a particular direction, and then we saw what happened afterwards. We didn't respect the democratic outcome as Americans, and we should have, since the Bush administration did know that Hamas was participating, and that was part of the overall understanding, even if, yeah. So if you want them to participate and then they win, you got to respect that. And, Condoleezza Rice was shocked. She was on her treadmill at 5 a.m., the kind of lore of the story, and she almost fell off her treadmill when she found out the results, whatever. But so I think that that's one point we have to make. That said, that Hamas no longer exists. And I think that I am of the view that the American Muslim community should be very clear and not equivocal about their condemnation of Hamas and what it did on October 7th. But that's a different kind of maybe discussion that's maybe outside the scope of what we're doing here. But I don't think there is really a place for, you can understand Hamas as a political organization, but I don't think it really is particularly helpful to be what might be called sympathetic towards Hamas, in part because of what they did. So I think that in that way, it's very hard for American Muslims to talk about, because it's sort of this thing that, how do we talk about it? And there are some disagreements perhaps in the community about the best way to kind of approach a delicate issue. But I think politically, that's sort of, I would personally advise a certain kind of approach, which would be it's not that difficult to say that what Hamas did was a terrorist act and they targeted civilians. Over 700 out of the 1,200 people who were killed were civilians. The rest were security forces. So clearly this is a mass atrocity terrorist attack. So I don't think it's like rocket science, but I think at the same time we can say that a movement is a terrorist organization, but also understand their history. those are not in opposition with each other. We did that for Al-Qaeda. We did not to say that those are equivalent to Hamas, but I think it's possible to academically approach an issue with nuance, but to also say, yeah, they're a terrorist organization.
So I'm glad you raised the elephant in the room question because it is important to engage. You know, on the one hand, I think the sort of the choice of Hamas to use violence as a tactic is not best understood by reference to their historical connection to something called the Muslim Brotherhood. It's best explained by the specific political context of military occupation in which they exist. So in that sense, the Hamas use of violence is better understood by reference to Hezbollah's use of violence, right? A similar kind of context, even though Hezbollah obviously is not a Muslim Brotherhood affiliated or historically tied to that genealogy at all. Second, I think it is important to not ignore the fact that there is a transnational network of financiers, figures that have historical connections to movement Islam, that have in various ways provided funding to Hamas, primarily for their humanitarian activities, but we know that once that money reaches the region, there's fungibility in the way that it is used. And so I think the conversation about this has to be attentive to that reality. I don't think the policy response to it, though, is to broadly prescribe something called the Muslim Brotherhood. There are plenty of other national security mechanisms with regard to the designation of specific individuals that can and have been used to address that challenge.
I know that Nathan, you have to leave in a couple of minutes. Would you like to answer or have any final words or final remarks? Okay. So we'll take Zoom. Okay, let's take a couple of questions from our online participants.
So the first question from our online participants: could a blanket designation of the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization lead to shifts in the ideological orientations and repertoires of action of Islamist movements in their countries of origin and or within diasporic communities? And if so, in what ways? And then in a similar vein, different question though, do you think that the weak stance of Arab countries on the situation in Gaza and Palestine would push their citizens towards more of a Muslim conservative-oriented alignment on the political spectrum, thus enabling a chance for Muslim Brotherhood parties to govern and rise through democratic and or institutional mechanisms instead of through revolutions and uprisals?
Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll make this
Okay.
my final word.
Good.
Those are both two good questions, I would say. The second one, again, I think if this had been 10 or 15 years ago, perhaps, that you then had enough plasticity within the political process. But I don't think the current moment, I mean, the attitudes of most people in Muslim societies towards what's happening in Gaza is very, very clear. But to translate that into short-term political mobilization, I don't think seems to be happening right now. So I don't think this is a moment for that. And the first question in terms of designation and the message, I don't think it sends a particularly encouraging message, but I think one of the themes that all three of us have been emphasizing in very different ways is that this is primarily domestic. This effort is primarily domestic, and that there certainly are efforts afoot. I shouldn't say there are efforts afoot. There are efforts that are now very, very well entrenched in many societies that did have viable, I would say, democratic Islamist movements, to exclude them from the political process and to exclude the democratic process. So I don't think at this point they're watching what's happening in terms of domestic American law for signals about where the United States is going. I think the writing is already on the wall.
One foreign policy implication, I think, is that if Democrats win in 2028, I mean, I personally I mean, it shouldn't be the focus of the Muslim community, but as someone who works on these issues and has for a long time, I'd want to push Democratic policymakers to engage with members of Brotherhood organizations abroad. I mean, that's not happening under Trump for the most part, as far as I know. Good to see you, Nathan. But I think that at some point this is going to be a live issue again. And if the Brotherhood does get designated, it takes time to undo that. And I think it would tie the hands of American policymakers a few years down the road. I mean, let's say it's really hard to imagine, but just try to imagine it for a second, that there's some kind of small political opening in Egypt. At that time, we would want to have an open channel with Muslim Brotherhood members, or what's left of the Brotherhood, because the Brotherhood is basically split. It's a long story, but it's very weak now in Egypt. But still, it is worth engaging with people who are representative of that movement. At some point, this is going to matter again.
Yeah, I'm beginning to sound like a broken record, but this isn't about the region. Let's not get distracted and have a
No, but
conversation about
it could be about the region in the future.
Sure, in the future. But again, I'm thinking about a present imminent challenge
danger.
to democracy in the United States here. And so, if it was 15 years ago, I think there is something legitimate to talk about in terms of how a decision of this sort by the US government would have sent a signal to certain regimes to then behave in particular ways towards Islamist movements in their countries. Now I think the direction of causality is the opposite. There's more of a story to be told now about how regimes in the region are actually influencing the American policy debate on Islamist groups and claimed connections between the Muslim Brotherhood and American political organizations. And so that for me is what this conversation is actually
And
about.
that's why I think what Loay said is really important. This is a free speech issue. This is a democracy issue. This is an issue about who we are as a country. And it should be kind of grouped in with the attacks on American universities, on the attacks on people who express constitutionally protected pro-Palestine speech, and how there is an attempt by this administration to say that all pro-Palestine speech is anti-Semitic speech. This cuts to what makes America great, which is in part the First Amendment and our Bill of Rights. And so if this comes to pass, or if it's in process, I think that's the argument that folks on the Democratic Party side, because no one in the Democratic Party should be talking about, well, actually, as we've talked about, here's the history of the Muslim Brotherhood, and here's why it's not a good idea. No, this is a free speech issue, and it's a way to counter the authoritarian inclinations of this administration. And it's an authoritarian attack more broadly. And Muslims are one part of that broader story.
Okay, we have two more questions. Yes, Homera and over here. Okay.
Thank you. I will keep it domestic. While the legislative process may or may not go through it, and it takes a while to work through the legislative process, at the same time, we're seeing parallel designations which are happening through executive orders. Antifa has been declared a domestic terrorist organization. It's a movement. It's not an organization. We have a new domestic terrorism strategies and push, and there's a push happening in that space, which there was never before. Right? Because if you start creating designations for domestic terrorist organizations, at that point in time, again, think of how many of us are going to be impacted. Is there potential ways, like if there's an executive order tomorrow, right? An NPS, whatever, number 9, comes out and says, hey, Muslim Brotherhood in the US is a domestic terrorist organization, right? What should be the right steps or the steps for organizations and individuals to protect themselves? Because that's going to hit pretty much all of us in this room, right? 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, no one is going to be exempt, right? If you start to do one step, who is, who isn't, next. So what do we do?
I mean, but right, Peter, doesn't that not have a lot of legal import if it's just an executive order? I mean, you know about this more than I do. I mean, they can do that, but it doesn't have a lot of like legal implication as a State Department process would, right?
Well, there was a time when that was the case, but I don't believe we live in that time anymore, given the rapidly evolving norms around the legal standing that things that the White House declares have. So in theory, that should be the case, that it should not have anything like the standing of a finding out of the very robust either Department of Treasury or Department of State processes for identifying and designating terrorist organizations, which then trigger a very specific set of requirements in legislation with respect to funding, contact, et cetera, et cetera. So I unfortunately, I've had great faith in the robustness of the designation process, which is why previous episodes of this have not worried me too much, because I felt confident that those processes followed through would fail on the merits. But given the environment we live in now, Humera, I think that precisely the contingency that you mentioned is one that American Muslim communities need to be prepared for. And I think that, there's a combination of responses that would need to be triggered by that. Many of them are legal in nature. I mean, that is an incredibly important terrain on which to contest these kinds of claims and designations. But there are also efforts to reach out to allies in American society more broadly, around the narrative of the Americanization of the American Muslim landscape. Many American Muslim organizations today have close ties and partnerships with non-Muslim groups and neighbors and communities in their midst. And so I think that will be an important point of it, including including in red, blue, and purple states. And so I think that kind of national level outreach will also be an important part of responding to this threat.
Final question.
Thank you. Finally taking my question. I happen to be an author, and I've written a memoir, and I happen to be a lifelong Republican. I've written a chapter on a Muslim Republican in the Trump era. I just want to follow up. You see, I believe our work is here. And we talk about Middle East and Brotherhood. I was born in India. I came here in 1969, probably before some of you were born. I went to Aligarh Muslim University. I never heard of Brotherhood there at that time. And really, I know I communicate with the grassroots Republicans all the time. Someone mentioned the MAGA doesn't really care about Brotherhood. It's the congressional leaders, whatever. And I have developed relationship because I lived on Treasure Coast. The Congressman Brian Mast, everybody hates him because he can't talk to him about Palestine. However, I educated him about our diversity. We are not a monolith community. You never hear of any terrorism coming out of 220 million Muslims in India or Indonesia. So my question is, I'm going to keep it short as much as I can. What we're educating us, I learned a lot. I think we need to educate, particularly the Republican Party. They will hear the first question, actually, first time I met with Brian, he talked about Brotherhood. I said, he's from Michigan, young man. I called him Brian. I said, what the hell are you talking about? I have no clue what that is. And I educated him about our community. And I developed relationship with him and a couple of Zoom calls. And my focus was what's happening in India. It's no different from what's happening with the Palestinians, believe me. There is genocide in Assam, there is lynching. So, we have so many issues. And we are not a monolith community, and we just focus on one thing. The bottom line, last thing, we need to educate the Republican leadership. And I have seen Rashad, he calls me uncle. He was made the head of the IRF, and Cruz voted for him. 96 senators voted for him. So they elected a Muslim. to head the International Religious Freedom Forum. So I think, I believe, and I don't know how you'll respond, our work is here, and that's where we are has to be focused, and particularly the Republican Party, if you all feel that, there is an issue with them.
Thank you. Final
Yeah, look,
answers.
I mean, good luck with that. I think more people should do that. It's not necessarily the work that I'm going to do. But there are obviously a lot of Republican Muslims. I know they're trying to fight the good fight the way they can, and they should continue doing that. I don't think we should become a monolith and we shouldn't be taken for granted by one party or another. My preference is that I think that there's more that we can do within the Democratic Party, but of course, I wouldn't want every Muslim in America to be part of the Democratic Party because then we would lose any leverage we have. And it's important to have influence with both parties ultimately. The good news is that MAGA does seem to be shifting on Palestine, and since this issue is connected to Palestine, I mean, how you view what's happening in Gaza usually translates into how you view Muslims. They are related. So the fact that young Republicans are now moving away from Israel, according to recent polling, really in a stark fashion compared to what it was just a few years ago, that should give us some solace. I mean, the fact that someone like Marjorie Taylor Greene was the first Republican lawmaker to call it a genocide, and even Charlie Kirk, apparently, this is a whole debate about whether Charlie Kirk in his final weeks was having a change of heart on Gaza. I don't think that's ever going to be decisively resolved, but there are some, that is a claim. So there clearly is a faction of MAGA that is starting to view these issues in a different light, and I think that should be encouraged, and maybe that gives us some room for maneuver going forward.
I mean, this may be where Shadi and I have a bit of a difference. 'Cause strategically, I agree with you. Like, there is no long-term home for American Muslims in the Republican Party as presently constituted. I'm just not sure how much longer the categories, Republican, Democrat, will continue to have relevance as the American political landscape evolves. And so I would almost want to imagine what kind of post-partisan politics conversations about these issues look like. I'm emphasizing engagement with the Republican Party as a shorter term tactic in relation to this specific issue, exactly for the reasons that you mentioned, Shadi, that there are segments of the MAGA movement that are coming away on some of these issues, and the fact that those who are most focused on the designation of the Muslim Brotherhood, do not come out of the core body politic of where the political right in the United States is right now. And so I think there's a conversation to be had there.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you so much. Can we give a round of applause to our wonderful, and I kind of want to bring it back to domestic again. I think we at Impact and American Muslim communities, our focus is domestic work. The focus is to protect our institutions, protect American Muslim communities, and ensure that they are thriving and they are doing well in every aspect of civic, political, and economic life. And these conversations are important to that. These conversations are critical to that thriving of our communities. And so thank you all for joining us. We will continue to follow this topic. We definitely think that the domestic implications are real. They are legal, they are political, and we will continue to follow them and we'll continue to update you. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you to those online as well.